towards the end of my tenure at Goldman, it became very clear to me that the lows were definitely much lower than the highs were high because I was fucking miserable. I felt ensnared. I felt trapped. A corporate job requires you to be at a certain place at a certain time, wearing a certain attire and having to speak in a certain way. And I just cannot do that. I hate being controlled. So when is it that it dawned upon you that this is not quite the path that you see yourself following going forward?
Week 2 at Deloitte. And that's when I sent my first resume out, was week 2 on the job.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
Hey guys, so the following is a conversation that I had with a college friend of mine. His name is Ziran Wang. Ziran had strong ambitions to work in consulting after graduating college, whereas I had strong ambitions to work in investment banking. And both Ziran as well as I were successful in turning our respective ambitions into reality when Ziran got a job offer to work as a consultant at Deloitte upon graduation, whereas I got a job offer to work as an investment banker at Goldman Sachs. But very soon, our dream jobs turned into absolute nightmares, which led to both Ziran as well as I quitting our respective six-figure consulting and investment banking professions. And this video, which is a very no-holds-barred, radically honest, unfiltered conversation between the two of us, chronicles this journey of ours and what was it that actually led us to pulling the trigger on quitting our respective six-figure professions, despite the fact that this move of ours, on paper at least, seemed like a very ridiculous and ludicrous one. Enjoy. When you have a title similar to investment banking analyst or investment banking vice president at a Goldman Sachs or some big product manager at a tech company, when you have a very quote unquote sexy title that's associated with your name, then that job description, as sad as that may be, that job description ends up becoming your self-description. Because that now is what gives you importance, what soothes your ego, what satisfies your ego, what makes you feel good about yourself, as opposed to what you're actually doing as part of that role on a day-to-day basis. There might be lots of people, and again, not judging whatsoever, but there might be, or maybe I'm judging a bit, but there might be lots of people who have an extremely sexy title, working at the sexiest of firms, but at the same time, they're hating what they're doing, but they still continue to do what they're doing because they are deriving their status or the happiness from the title next to the name, as opposed to the ins and outs of what they're doing.
What I would prefer is if they were just honest, like, yo, I'm doing this for the money. I'm doing this for the ego. I do it because my boss pats me on the back and I really like getting my back patted by my boss and it makes me feel good. And I like that my LinkedIn title says this. I wish they would just say that. But I think what is bothersome is that in reality, the first step for you to be to find your North Star in life is to be honest with yourself. And then therefore you can work towards bettering yourself in the right movements and the right actions. But if you continue to lie to yourself by having this big ego or saying, justifications of, oh, I really like tech or I really like finance, when really you just like the paycheck, is you just stall your growth.
Ziran, I think there's a big difference between lying to others and lying to yourself. So I have been in a similar boat as well, but I've said lies to others, but I've told others just to, feel cooler and sexy about myself. I've gone ahead and told others that, yes, I love my job as an investment banking analyst at Goldman Sachs. I love what I'm doing. And it's definitely the most enviable or coveted thing that anyone could be doing. But I've never been able to lie to myself. Like I've never been so delusional that I've brainwashed myself into believing that the shitty job that I'm doing is actually the best thing for me. That has never happened. That's never happened. And so
I will clarify. I think it has happened.
Yeah.
And I think we had it at the same period in time, and that was college. Both of us lied to ourselves. And you could call it lying. Do you call it lying? At the time, we really wanted to go work at Goldman Sachs and Deloitte. Both of us did, right?
Yeah.
Respectively.
Yeah. But I don't
do
think
you call that lying to yourself? Or
I wouldn't call that lying. I wouldn't call that lying because back then, especially when we were in college, we were so oblivious in the sense we had such little self-awareness that we couldn't think independently. Like we just didn't know what was it that made us tick. As a result, instead of actually listening to our inner voice, which wasn't even formed, it was very easy for us to defer our decisions, or if not defer our decisions, but make our decisions based upon what the others are doing, what the herd is doing, what the pack is doing. because we couldn't think independently. But as you have more and more experiences in life, diverse experiences, as you go through like the ups and downs of life, the trials and tribulations, and if you actually spend time thinking as opposed to simply doing, which is something that we were doing in college, like literally preoccupied from morning until night, just doing and spending long hours at the library, we
Yeah.
barely got any time to think.
Yeah.
Barely got any time to think. Like college is also supposed to be a time of your life when you become a lot more self-aware, when you learn a lot about yourself. But that
Yeah.
only happens when you spend the hours sitting down with yourself.
Yeah.
But for us, thinking meant not being productive because we weren't quite creating something tangible. We weren't quite creating something on paper that we
Yeah.
typically create when we're working on homework or assignments or midterms.
Yeah.
And so thinking wasn't construed as being productive.
Yeah.
But I wish I spent more time thinking back in college. I wish I'd taken a gap year before college as well. So I said I
Yeah.
could spend that one year learning more about myself, which is
Yeah.
something that a lot of people do. But you become short-term greedy. Oh, all my friends will have started college or will have finished year one of college when I'm just starting out if I end up taking the gap year. So you become short-term greedy as opposed to being long-term greedy.
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't call that lying because we didn't know much else.
You wanted to go work at Goldman Sachs. You started in Jacksonville. I remember those days. You'd call me up. You're like, I'm in Jacksonville. I'm like, what does that mean? And you're like, I got to be in New York because that's where all the finance big dogs are. You know, and I was there too. I was
The big swinging dicks.
big swing dicks. And I was there at Deloitte. I was like, hey, look, I'm gonna, this is my life. This is what I'm gonna do. This is how I'm gonna make a lot of money. And I saw a lot of my ego and my self-worth in that. But you started listening to yourself internally. And the question is, how did you do that? How did you start? How did you start from having a lot of your ego tied to your LinkedIn title and your job, and having this mentality of, I got to be in New York from Jacksonville? And how did you start listening to yourself and being like, hey, look, I really like cricket. I really like sports presenting, and getting that life. It's a hard thing. I don't know. How did you do it?
Dude, it was tough. It was tough. It was a gamble. Like it definitely required a lot of soul searching. And I don't mean this in a corny or cheesy way, but it entailed spending time with yourself, asking yourself the difficult questions as opposed to simply sliding them under the rug. And when you're going through misery, on a day-to-day basis, it's hard for you to actually lie with a straight face. It's hard for you to convince others that you're enjoying what you're doing, or convince yourself that you're enjoying what you're doing when you're clearly not. There might be some days when you feel great about yourself, but towards the end of my tenure at Goldman, it became very clear to me that the lows were definitely much lower than the highs were high. It became very clear to me. And that required me going back to the drawing board and thinking about a contingency plan, thinking about what's next, thinking about what I could do such that I can dig myself out of this hole, because I was fucking miserable on most days. There were some days that would give me this false sense of hope, but on most days I felt miserable. Not to mention the fact that different strokes for different folks, but I cannot for the life of me think about anymore, based upon my minimal experience, I cannot for the life of me think about doing a proper traditional corporate job, like a 9 to 5 or a 9 to 6 or a 9 to 7 or what have you. Because a corporate job, in a nutshell, requires you to be at a certain place at a certain time, wearing a certain attire, and having to speak in a certain way. And I just cannot do that. I hate being controlled. I absolutely hate being controlled. And I felt ensnared. I felt trapped. Yes, I was working on the 30th something floor of a skyscraper in Tribeca in Manhattan, Goldman Sachs headquarters, 200 West Street. Sounds very sexy, in the investment banking division, the most sought after, the most coveted bloody division there is. It sounds very sexy. And the people who are dying to fucking get their foot in the door. Receiving emails from people saying, hey, Anubhav, could we please do an informational interview or an informational chat sometime in the near future so that I can get guidance from you on how to break in? And I swear to God, I was just like, do not break in. You'll become the author of your own misfortune or the architect of your own downfall. But Carl Jung says something which makes a lot of sense. And he says, no tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach all the way down to hell. In other words, you have to sometimes experience something that's hellish, something that's miserable, to actually see the light at the end of the tunnel. But that's only if you've had the courage to go to the drawing board, admit the fact that there's something not quite right about the status quo, about how your life is unfolding at the moment, and there's something that needs to change. So instead of you looking at your current circumstances as a stumbling block, you look at it as a stepping stone towards change.
Yeah.
It's not an obstacle, but it's an opportunity to end up doing something different, something that aligns with your set of skills, strengths, and interests.
Yeah.
And so that was everything that I concluded when I went through that miserable phase when I was soul searching. Because I was and I think you know the story as well, but towards the end, I was simply using alcohol, marijuana, cigarettes as means of escape, to escape the miserable life at doing investment banking at Goldman Sachs. So something had to change. Now it's good that I'm someone who's very impatient. Like if I had a greater tolerance for torture, then I probably would have stayed along. I probably would have stayed for much longer. But I'm someone
Yeah.
who doesn't have that big a tolerance for boredom, for torture. I get bored very easily. I need new forms of stimulation.
Yeah.
And so when I felt that things were getting miserable, drab, monotonous, boring, weren't affairs weren't quite stimulating enough for me, I knew that something had to change. But it entails making a hard decision, because when you're pivoting to something else, something totally drastic, especially when you're in your mid 20s, late 20s, you have to accept the fact that you're going to be taking a few steps back in the short term. And then believe.
We talked about that a lot. We talked
And
about that a lot
believe-
back in the day.
Yeah. And believe that in the long term, in the medium term, you can make up all that lost ground.
Yeah.
I didn't quite feel a sense of belonging doing banking, but I
Yeah.
just felt that if I pivot to sports presenting, that combines my number one interest and my number one strength beautifully. My number one interest being sports, after women, of course. I'm kidding. And my number one strength, according to me at least, being my communication skills, not being a braggart. I felt that's something from which I can derive a sense of belonging.
Yeah.
And it's still relatively early days in my career as a sports presenter, but I'm still equipped with that belief that it's going to work out, because now I feel a sense of belonging. And with every new gig, with every new project that I undertake, that sense of belonging only strengthens. You asked me this question about when I sort of realized that I was probably not heading down the right path and that I had to change, or at least make an effort towards changing. Look, you had a similar mindset, a similar objective when you were in college. If not banking, then consulting, working at a McKinsey, as you said. So when is it that it dawned upon you that this is not quite the path that you see yourself following going forward?
Week 2 at Deloitte. I went to training at Deloitte. Deloitte was my first job. It was my dream job. Week 1, we went to training in DC, and they were trying to teach us PowerPoint and Excel. And I was like, what the hell is this? This is nonsense. This feels like I'm back in kindergarten. They had people teaching you how to do PowerPoint and click around in Excel. And it just felt, and them asking you the most basic questions, and then forcing people to answer the most basic questions when it was the most obvious thing. It felt like kindergarten again. Then week 2, we had training in Dallas. And that's when I sent my first resume out, was week 2 on the job.
Are you serious?
Yeah. And then from week 2 to month 6, I applied to maybe 300 jobs. And then I left month 8 or 9. I knew it wasn't for me the first couple of weeks. And I don't know.
But tell me something. It takes a lot of balls, a lot of gumption to come up with such a big conclusion that soon. Because a lot of people, I'm pretty sure you must have consulted people as well, and they'll tell you, look, whenever you're starting something new, give it at least, especially when you're starting a new job, give it at least a year, if not a couple of years, before you can actually come up with a definitive conclusion that you're fairly confident about. But the fact that you came up with that conclusion in week 2, granted, you didn't act upon that conclusion immediately, but not too much after your second week at Deloitte is when you started applying for different jobs. And in less than a year after having joined the company is when you jump ship, you started doing something else. Were you very confident that this is not for you? Did you at all feel that, oh, I might be jumping the gun here, or I might be coming up with a strong conclusion a bit too prematurely without quite having tested the waters for longer.
No, no. For Deloitte, it was. I mean, it was week 2, so I was pretty confident in that. Like, hey, I'm going to get out of here because it was all stuck up. People, suit and tie. I mean, I'm wearing Tom and Jerry. Everything was suit and tie. Everything was buttoned up. Everyone talked like a robot. Everyone walked like a robot. Everyone did things like a robot, and it just wasn't the place for me. So I knew. The question is, in general, though, and this is an interesting question for you as well, is how long do you let things like that's on the spectrum? Very confident I needed to get out of there, right? But there's a lot of actions in life that are in the middle ground that are like, hey, I really don't know. So then I start, you start asking your friends, asking your parents, asking whoever around you, yo, what should I do here, right? And in those things, how do you get around that? Like how long do you stay? Like for example, relationships. If you're kind of like, I've got a lot of friends, they're all going through relationship issues, right? How long do you stay in a relationship that you've got the pros and cons, or it's like in this middle ground? Like it's very obvious you're not meant for a girl or Deloitte. Easy. If it's very obvious you're meant for a company or a girl, very easy. But a lot of life is in this gray zone where you're like, you know what? I kind of like the girl. I like the way she looks, but I don't like the way she says this thing. But I also don't like the way she does this. But I also like the way that she, maybe dresses, and also like, my friends kind of like her. So, so how do you deal with that, right? Do you keep stringing along? Do you date her for, a year or two, and then keep testing the waters? Meanwhile, like, you have no idea what she's thinking, right? She could be thinking either the same thing or something else. I mean, relationships complicated a lot because there's another person on the other line. It's a lot easier with a job, right? Because it's just you against, Deloitte, or you against Goldman Sachs. How do you do that? I don't know. That's really tough. Life is really hard that way. The middle ground stuff is the stuff that I'd like answers around. And, I think a lot of people go through it. I mean, what do you think?
Dude, it was difficult. It was difficult. Like I was not even remotely close to being as decisive as you were, because you feel as if for the last God knows how many years, at least throughout college, like the 4.5 years that you spent in college, you've gone through blood, sweat, and beers, not tears, but blood, sweat, beers, tears, all of that, just so that you could land your quote unquote dream job. And then when things don't quite transpire in accordance with the grand vision that you had in your mind before you embarked upon your corporate journey at your dream destination, then it's a bitter pill to swallow, to say the least. It's a very bitter pill to swallow. And so I think sometimes you go through like the 5 stages of grief before you come to accept the fact that maybe this it wasn't meant to be. It just wasn't. But for me, at least, speaking from personal experience, maybe with the aid of hindsight, I can say this, but I wanted to prolong the inevitable for as long as possible. Because
that's what a lot of people find themselves doing in life in general, not just their job, their current life situation, their relationship, a lot of things.
Exactly. Because yes, you have this, you keep asking yourself, what if there's something better out there? And this applies to jobs as well as relationships. But at what price? Like, what if I don't end up getting something that's better out there? What if I end up losing what was meant to be mine? What if I can give it some more time, invest a bit more energy, keep chipping away at this, and something might just like open up for me? Or all of a sudden I wake up and think as if this is where I was meant to be. So it's a very bitter pill to swallow. And I go through a lot of indecisiveness and analysis paralysis. And so I'm always plagued by the ambivalence of my feelings, even when it comes to making the most trivial of decisions. But I'll tell you what, something that gives me a lot of solace and comfort. Number one, control the controllables, right? There's some things that happen that are beyond your control. And even if like what's happened is unfortunate and you've been dealt a bad hand, you just accept it and move on because it was outside of your control, right? You just maybe had like a bad stroke of luck. So that's something that helps. But the other thing that really helps is that, say, for instance, you end up making a decision. A lot of people say everything happens for a reason. So I don't think it's as simple as that. I don't think it's as simple as saying everything happens for a reason. And so whatever decision I've made is the right decision because everything happens for a reason. I certainly believe, and I didn't have this mentality when I was in college, when I was an eternal pessimist, but I certainly believe that the human spirit is so strong, the human character is so indomitable, that regardless of what the circumstances are, regardless of what perilous situation that you find yourself in, you will find a way to adapt to that situation with aplomb. And when you adapt to that situation with aplomb, more often than not, there's some positive that emerges from it. And once that positive emerges from it, that's when you look back on what happened. And it's easy for you to say everything happens for a reason.
I agree. I agree. There's a video that I watched. I think it's like Pursuit of Life on YouTube, and he talked about making a big decision, like one big decision, right? And then the path verges. And the big decision that he was talking about in the video was, should you move with a business partner to a new country and start a business? And then therefore you'd have to sacrifice your life in America with your girlfriend that eventually will become your wife. And then he played out the two scenarios. And ultimately, the point of the video was, regardless of which path you went down, which at the time, like if you are at that path where the point of the path where it verges, you think it's probably the biggest decision in your life, right? You probably think, wow, like if I make the bad decision here, this is going to ruin my life. And then he played out the two worlds, the two paths that this guy could take. And then one path, you go to Australia, you do your business. Let's say it's mediocre. Let's say it was successful. I think it was like decently successful. He meets another girl there, and then he just continues, like he has kids with that girl in Australia. He continues doing his business. The business is decently successful. You ride the highs and lows of life, because regardless, every single day is, you're going to have some good days, you're going to have some bad days, right? Like fast forward 20 years, like when he's like, 45, he's run a good business in Australia. He's with a good girl in Australia. They've got kids. There's some highs, there's some lows, there's some bickering, there's grocery shopping, there's going to sports games, there's watching TV, all that, right? And then there's annoying stuff like the dog shit on your carpet, right? Then you play out the other path. You stay in America, you don't do the business, you stay with the girl, you end up marrying her, right? You marry her, you have a life in America, you have 2 or 3 kids with that girl, and you have, a quote unquote regular job. And then you roll on with the highs and lows of life, right? There's some good things, right? You married the girl of your dreams, right? The girl of your dreams. You have 3 beautiful kids with her, and you got promoted up, your company a couple of times. Now you're maybe a VP, you drive a nice car, but then there's some down days, right? The dog shits on your carpet, right? There's some down days. So either way, you're at the fulcrum. You think these two paths are going to drastically change your world, but in reality, the point of the video was that either way, your life is going to go on. You're going to have some good days. You're going to have some bad days. And it's really just a mentality. So it kind of puts a lot of decisions at ease when you're like, you know what? Like, yeah, anything can happen, and you just roll with it. And then if you're a very optimist, like you said, you can then look back and be like, you know what? Things are good. In one scenario, I'm a VP at a company. I've got 3 beautiful kids. I live in America, and I married the girl of my dreams. In the other scenario, I have a pretty successful business in Australia. I met a new Australian chick. We got 3 beautiful kids, right? And then things happen for a reason. Imagine like life as like a chart, like a linear, like x-axis, and there's a bunch of peaks and mountains, right? You were just placed somewhere randomly on this x-axis, right? And there's mountains around you, right? And the mountain climbers are the people that just climb the mountain next to them, because that's just the most achievable mountain that they see. It's like us going to Georgia Tech. We saw the achievement to get, this high paying job and work a really good paying job and then make a lot of money. That's what we saw. That's what we were surrounded by, because that was in our purview. That was the mountain ahead of us.
Yeah.
But in reality, you don't ask yourself, was I placed in the right part of this x-axis? Like, is there a bigger mountain for me that is like a more meaningful mountain?
See, the difficult bit is that in order for you to actually traverse a different mountain or climb a different mountain, you have to descend the mountain that you're currently climbing and then start all over again. And there's often this sunk cost fallacy that kicks in as well, where you feel that you're invested in something, hence you ought to complete the investment or complete the life cycle of the investment. Say, for instance, you've taken a massive punt on some single stock, and the stock isn't doing well, God forbid. You still feel as if you ought to cling on to that decision of yours, even though it might be a much better decision to cut your losses, take your losses, and then invest elsewhere. But that would mean going against your ego or against the big decision that you made, and starting afresh. So that's the sunk cost fallacy. I'm already sunk in this. I'm already invested in this. Hence, I'll continue even though it might not be the most judicious use of my money. It takes effort, time, energy to start afresh, especially when you feel as if, oh, others already have this advantage in terms of like time that they've invested in their respective careers. But
Yeah.
actually, and I know it sounds like corny and cliched, but maybe I can say this with a lot more confidence now, given the path that I've traversed. But I actually feel it's never too late to start new. It's never too late to start new, because someone else who might be doing a job, not a calling, a job or a career at best. There's job, there's career, and then you could say there's a calling. Someone who's doing a job or a career at best might end up having like a linear progression in terms of like the growth that he or she is experiencing, because it's a job, it's a career. Like it doesn't make that person tick, it doesn't make that person feel alive. There are good aspects, there are bad aspects, and the person rolls with the fucking punches. But I think you could be starting out much later, maybe 4 years, 5 years, who knows, a fucking decade later. But you end up finding something that's your calling or something that's close to your calling. Then, even though when the other person has already taken off and you might be just starting out here, that person continues to experience linear growth. You, on the other hand, there's a high probability that you'll experience exponential growth. And there comes a point, the inflection point, when your exponential growth ends up passing the linear growth that person is experiencing. And that's how
Sure.
I like to look at it. And that's how I maybe justify like the weird trajectory that I've gone through in my professional life.